Good evening, everyone. My name is Malka Simkovich, and I'm the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies and the Director of Catholic Jewish Studies at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. I am delighted to welcome you all to this year's Fall Shapiro Lecture, our inaugural event of the year. Our 3 annual Shapiro Lectures offer incredible opportunities to learn from renowned Jewish studies scholars, and I'm thrilled to see that we have friends in attendance tonight from all over the world to hear our featured speaker, Dr. Lawrence Schiffman. Dr. Schiffman is the Judge Abraham Lieberman Professor in Hebrew and Judaic Studies and the Director of the Global Institute for Advanced Research in Jewish Studies at New York University. He is the author of numerous books that have transformed the study of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the study of early Judaism. These books include his 1985 work, Who Was a Jew? Rabbinic and Halachic Perspectives on the Jewish-Christian Schism, his 1991 book, From Text to Tradition, A History of Judaism in Second Temple and Rabbinic Times. And I see that among our participants tonight, some of you teach this book in your classrooms. It's used across the world, across the country, and university and high school settings. His acclaimed 1994 book, Reclaiming the Dead Sea Scrolls, is another fan favorite. One of Dr. Schiffman's most significant contributions has to do with how he has upended the predominant notion prevalent among scholars in the 1960s and 70s, that the scrolls were primarily significant in terms of how they shed light on early Christianity. Dr. Schiffman challenged this notion and revolutionized the field of early Judaism by encouraging scholars and lay people alike to read the Dead Sea Scrolls within their proper Jewish context. His status as a world-class scholar, moreover, derives not only from his important publications, but as you'll see tonight, his dynamic and erudite speaking style. While many scholars are rather dry speakers, Dr. Schiffman is one who can captivate any audience. Perhaps most significantly of all, Dr. Schiffman's reputation as a collegial mentor makes him unique in the field. And here I want to add that when I was working on my second book, Discovering Second Temple Literature, Dr. Schiffman spent too many hours editing my manuscript, literally line by line, and sending me feedback, saving me from certain humiliation. And he did this all as a volunteer with no expectation of compensation. I mentioned this recently to a mutual colleague, Dr. Stephen Fine, who spoke at CTU back in 2019. And he said to me, of course Larry would do that, but you're not special. Everybody knows that that's just who Larry is. All of this is to say that I'm truly honored to be welcoming Dr. Larry Schiffman this evening as our annual Fall Shapiro speaker. And while it was a difficult decision to hold this event over Zoom rather than in person, I'm so glad that we are able to reach so many people this evening who will have the privilege of learning from this remarkable scholar. We will leave aside time at the end of this lecture for questions, but feel free to post comments, questions, impressions in the chat box anytime throughout the lecture, or you can send them directly to me. I will then direct some of these questions to Dr. Schiffman at the end of the lecture during our Q&A. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lawrence Schiffman.
Thank you very much. I want to start by thanking all of my colleagues here, and especially Professor Malka Simkovich, for this wonderful invitation and for organizing this program, even if as it ends up, we won't be meeting in person. Hopefully we do have the opportunity to reach a large audience. I very much appreciate the honor of being asked to speak at CTU. I was there years ago. I don't remember exactly when. I imagine that there may not even be anybody there now who was there, but at any rate, that was also a nice opportunity, which of course was held in person. We didn't even know what sharing your screen meant, and we never heard of Zoom, etc. Now, it's a pleasure to begin this lecture by telling you that I stole the title from a colleague who's online, and actually the top of whose head I actually see right now. And that is Professor Eileen Schuler, who wrote the first and I think only article on this topic that exists. And I am, of course, indebted to this article because it set out some of the important principles which I'm going to be using this evening. And what I'm going to be trying to do is to provide a kind of wider view of the topic, which will accept her suggestions and important observations and conclusions, but try to place it in a wider historical context that I think will be helpful in understanding the topic. Now, I have to tell you that she spoke in her article, she wrote about three major themes: the academic study of early Judaism and early Christianity. People don't usually understand that as a form of dialogue, but we'll see how it is. Statements from Jewish-Christian dialogue, which she brought in her article, and a very important aspect, personal relationships of scholars. And I might say that my relationship with her is actually an illustration of this. And I hope that I'm not saying too much in public when her face is right in front of me, but we are very old and good friends. Now, the point I want to make here is that what she did, which was very important, is to understand Jewish-Christian dialogue as way more than these religious meetings. And we're going to follow that approach. I have to tell you, I participate in many of these interreligious meetings, and especially on the international level with the Catholic Church. And what I find is that nothing works like personal relationships. And I think that the realization that dialogue is not a bunch of meetings that are held officially where people are sort of formal and tense, right? That understanding is necessary to see the Dead Sea Scrolls in the context of Jewish-Christian dialogue. Now, we need to take a few minutes to make sure that everybody knows what the Dead Sea Scrolls are and what they are not. So we'll just take a few minutes. First of all, there are 900 mostly fragmentary Hebrew Aramaic and a few Greek manuscripts. Now, most of them are fragments, and you've probably seen actual examples of the larger scrolls, but that's just a very small number of scrolls, about 10 that actually could be really considered scrolls of that nature. Also, the copies that we have date, excuse the typo there, from something like 225 BCE to the latest 50 CE. We're not talking here about the Masada and Bar Kokhba texts. We're talking about the texts from Qumran, what we usually call the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were composed before the rise of Christianity, even if some may have been copied at the very early stage of Christianity. They were found in caves around the sectarian center at Qumran. And there's no question that there was a Jewish sectarian group that gathered these scrolls, that lived according to those that are what we call the sectarian scrolls. And of course, as I think most people know, the majority view is that they are the Essenes described by Philo and Josephus. Interestingly, a group not mentioned by that name in the Talmud or the New Testament. In any case, I've found that there is a lot of agreement with the priestly trend in Jewish law. And I think over time, even those who identify the sectarians as the Essenes have come to realize that that's an important part about the nature of this group. Now, what they are not, they're not Christian. Jesus and John the Baptist are not mentioned, despite the fact that some people have written some pretty crazy books making different claims. John the Baptist, by the way, is not buried at Qumran, despite what some newspapers may have said. They are certainly not from the 3rd century Ebionite Christians, we know from Carbon 14 date. They're not the mainstream Jewish Jerusalem libraries. They're definitely a sectarian library. They're not medieval Karaite. And even though there are some forged fragments, the scrolls we're talking about are not forged. There are 70 forged fragments. Don't buy any. You'll be making a very big mistake, especially for $750,000 per fragment, right? But having said that, the ones we're talking about are real ancient scrolls. Now, what I want to do first is to set this whole thing in terms of where the study of Judaism and early Christianity, what was going on in that field beforehand. And I want to do this so that people will understand how significant the timing of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls was, especially when it came right essentially close to the very end or right after the end, depending on the dating there, of the Holocaust and World War II. So we have to begin by understanding that in the Renaissance, starting with Azaria de Rossi, Jews had begun to turn to the Second Temple period and to read literature in Greek. He specifically, in his book, which, by the way, you can't buy the Hebrew Ma'orei Naim at all, but you can get the English at least. The English translation is a very good job. Anyhow, this work is a scholarly work, mostly about Second Temple times, in which the author uses Philo, Josephus, and the New Testament. One could say that this is the beginning of what we would call the scientific study of these two traditions, not really studied together, but at least in a situation in which the material pertaining to the Jewish tradition in the New Testament and other such sources is being used. Now, soon after that, another very important person was John Lightfoot. And what Lightfoot did was to essentially begin the use of rabbinic literature as an important tool for understanding of the New Testament. Now, we know today that in certain ways that is outmoded, although I have to say there are many places where rabbinic literature remains an important tool for understanding the New Testament. But it was only in a certain pioneering way that he began this use of Jewish sources to understand Christian sources. So what I'm trying to show you now is that there is a beginning of an intellectual use of each other's sources already in the period of the Renaissance and then running into the Reformation. Now, furthermore, beginning really already in the 1700s, there starts to be the recollection, if we can call it, maybe I'll steal my own title, the reclaiming of a whole variety of Second Temple texts that were being kept in various Eastern churches. And of course, these were brought together by R.H. Charles in his famous work. But what was so significant about that work is that he understood the significance of these Jewish works for understanding Christianity, but also for understanding Second Temple Judaism as its own phenomenon. So it turns out that by the time you get to the early 1900s, you already have the beginnings of the intellectual use of the traditions, Jewish traditions to understand early Christianity, Christian traditions to understand early Judaism. And these are, of course, essentials to what is going to come later on. Then the first Dead Sea Scroll gets discovered, and it's discovered in the Cairo Geniza by Solomon Schechter, who publishes the material in 1911, and immediately after, Louis Ginsburg, the great Talmud scholar, writes an unbelievable work, Eine unbekannte jüdische Sekte, published in English later on as an unknown Jewish sect. But the point I want to make is that this is really the first Dead Sea Scroll. This touched off a return of Jewish scholars and Christian scholars who already were interacting with one another at a high level to discuss this new sect, its place in Second Temple times, and it intensified a lot of the interest in Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, and all those other works that were now much more available as a result of the fact that many of these texts had been brought to Europe and published in the 17th and 1800s. And now the whole field of Second Temple studies and the background of Christianity was getting ready to go, we might say, on to a new start. Now, of course, this is the time when World War II came and put a stop to all of this. Not only did it put a stop to all of this, but it also caused a tremendous dislocation, you might say, of Jewish and Christian cooperation for all kinds of reasons. Sadly, we know that some Christian scholars involved in this field were Nazi supporters. Many Jews in the field didn't know to what extent they could really continue to work with Christian scholars, and there seemed to be a kind of a slowdown. And the point I want to make is that it's exactly at this point that the Bedouin boy goes into Cave 1 and finds the first scrolls. Now, really, the story of the Bedouin boy, to some extent, is less important than the average person might think, because the Cave 4, which was discovered in the 50s, yielded some close to remnants of some close to 500 texts, and as a result provided a lot more material. But Cave 1 did provide those scrolls that are close to complete or large scrolls, and at any rate, it set off the discussion, which really was your beginning discussion of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, in these scrolls, and here you see the rule of the community as an example, right, was all kinds of information about an ancient Jewish sect from the Second Temple period, other information about biblical interpretation of the Hebrew scriptures, and all kinds of stuff like this. And immediately there begins a contest for ownership of these scrolls. On the one hand, you see there John Trevor with Ashkenazar Samuel trying to make sure that the scrolls, and he says this explicitly in his book, would remain in Christian hands. And on the other hand, Professor Sukenik examining there the Thanksgiving scroll, and his son Yigael Yadin examining another scroll, trying to get these scrolls for what would soon be the state of Israel. Now, here we have to understand that stage one in scroll discussion was not what we would call Jewish-Christian dialogue. It was Jewish-Christian contest, followed by a separation, and of course, we know that separation was because the city of Jerusalem was separated as a result of the Israel War of Independence, and Qumran ended up where the scrolls were found on the Jordanian side, and the Israeli scholars worked on those scrolls that they were able to acquire, and those are the ones that are in the Shrine of the Book, although right now they're not in the Shrine of the Book because of an air conditioning failure, but they will hopefully be returned soon, the Shrine of the Book of the Israel Museum, and the others were in the Rockefeller Museum. Now, a very important fact that one has to know is that we're going to now get into the question of the effect of the Holocaust. Because what happened here, it's not just the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls and the effect of the Holocaust play together on this entire turn towards, on the one hand, Jewish-Christian dialogue, and on the other hand, studying Second Temple and early Judaism and Christianity together. And these things happen simultaneously. Now, I show you Vermeesh because Vermeesh was part of a group right after World War II ended. He had been a priest. He was saved initially by a convent, and then he remained in the church, became a priest, was part of a group in Paris. He describes this in his autobiography, a group in Paris that sought to get the church to do something about the problem of anti-Semitism in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Now, he writes there about how he was unsuccessful. I think people know that he eventually returned to being a Jew. And we do have to remember, however, that his work on the Dead Sea Scrolls and on Jesus the Jew was quite profound in making this point very early, making the point that there had to be, as a result of the Holocaust, an understanding of the Jewish context of Jesus in order to bring Jews and Christians together. And I think it's fair to say that despite the time that elapsed between the end of the Holocaust and, by the way, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and Vatican II, it's still a fact, and this is an observation of Professor Schuler, it's an observation of Professor Schuler, that without any question, these things operated in this kind of simultaneous, but not necessarily completely, over the table way. Now, in the 50s, Qumran was excavated, and of course, this was happening in Jordan, and there was a tremendous amount of work going on in the scrolls. But nonetheless, the Israeli scholars, which were in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University, the Shrine of the Book, etc., and those in Jordan had nothing to do with one another. In fact, I think one can say that the relationship they had was exactly the opposite of what would come later. So here's a funny fact. A bunch of scrolls that speak about a contentious relation of ancient groups of Jews in Second Temple times, including hatred for outsiders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and which also caused contention when they were discovered between Jews and Christians, ended up being a unifying factor for Jews and Christians, something we never would have expected if we had been back there at the beginning, or if we had been huddled in one of these two buildings trying to discuss our scrolls and saying, if only I knew what the other guys had. And that, I think, is a funny fact about the scrolls, but a happy one in the end. Now, you had an editorial team appointed We're not going to talk at length about this whole story of the delay of publication. You see the editorials team sitting in the Rockefeller Museum, and which was then called the Palestine Archaeological Museum. And you have also the archaeological excavations going on with G. Lancaster Harding and Father Millick and Father DeVoe. And all of these people were working on one side as if the other people didn't exist. And I want to say that the basic approach that they were taking was to see what could be learned from the scrolls to understand Christianity. Now, this is true about a number of books, including books by people that were either Jewish or very friendly to Jewish people. What we're talking about now does not result from anti-Semitism. First, you had the Edmund Wilson book, which was making the claim, this is a later edition, making the claim that somehow or another the scrolls were going to upend Christianity. And that was the first example, because Christianization doesn't just mean that you are understanding the scrolls as supporting Christianity. It means you are understanding the scrolls as primarily related to Christianity. So that was also true with J.T. Millick, who was a great scholar and contributed a lot to the field of Dead Sea Scrolls, and certainly was true of the book, The Ancient Library of Qumran and Modern Biblical Studies by Frank Cross. This was a person who was a great supporter of Israel. But in his book, after he follows the Essene theory and he analyzed a lot of things about the sect, he then goes on to explain, as was traditional in all these books, the relevance for New Testament and Christianity, with zero discussion of its relevance for the history of Judaism. Now, ironically, and really ironically, this was the case also with David Flusser at the Hebrew University. He convinced enormous numbers of Israelis that the shrine of the book was a place for Christian pilgrims and Christian visitors, and it really wasn't of any great interest to the Jews. And it was only Yigael Yadin in 1967 when he recovered the temple scroll and his lectures afterwards that convinced Israelis that this material was really of great importance to them. So this is not a question of anti-Semitism. This is a question of people simply being interested in what they were interested in. Now, while all this is going on, of course, on the one hand, we're going to see in a few minutes that the scrolls are starting to be understood for what they really are, namely Second Temple Jewish texts, but it's going on at the very same time as Vatican II. Now, Vatican II, we can't underestimate the effect of Vatican II, not only on Catholics, but also on various Protestant groups. One could discuss at length which groups and to what extent. And unfortunately, I think one could say that in some groups, it hasn't been sufficiently effective. But at any rate, the effect of this coming when it does come, and was to make the point that Jews and Christians, to a great extent, could not be at each other's throats because of their common origins. And these common origins were already being understood based on the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we have to understand that the combination of Vatican II and the Dead Sea Scrolls led to a radical change in New Testament studies in the post-Shoah period. So first of all, it's clear that the Dead Sea Scrolls are a major part of bringing this about, even when it's not stated. And so suddenly we had this, I shouldn't say suddenly, we have the strengthening of this thing that had been going on already throughout, as I pointed out, starting already in the Renaissance and the Reformation, but the Jewish background of the New Testament. Now, here's a funny fact. One could argue that there was sufficient evidence to understand all these things previous to the discovery of the scrolls. But what happened is the scrolls served as a massive stimulus. And this massive stimulus was also, to a great extent, encouraged by the twin events, because I think they are twin events, of the Holocaust and Vatican II. Because vis-a-vis the Jews, this is a complicated question, by the way, because Vatican II included a statement which was about all other religions, which had originated as a statement about the Jews. And a compromise was made, and so it was about all other religions. But the truth is that a big purpose of this was to create a new relationship with the Jews, as would be clear from documents like Nostra Aetate in the end, in any case. So Jesus, another major change, the terminology, intertestamental period becomes the Second Temple Judaism. Jesus is seen now as a Jewish teacher in his origins. Nascent Christianity is seen as a Jewish sect. Contextualizing of anti-Judaism in the Gospels takes place, so that there are explanations that can be given of why the particular disagreements that are given there and some of the things that are said in very strong language don't really apply today. And we get the new perspective of seeing Paul within the Jewish context. And finally, we have the entry of Jews into New Testament scholarship. All of this seems to be a twin result of the way the scrolls affected the study of early Judaism and early Christianity, seeing Judaism in its background, as well as early Christianity for itself, as well as of Vatican II and the new moves towards good relations between Jews and Christians. Now, part of the story here, vis-a-vis this material, has to do with the Six-Day War, and that is because Qumran passed into the hands of Israel, where until today, it still remains. Now, it was in the aftermath of that Yigael Yadin was able to recover the Temple Scroll, which was a massive work having to do with primarily with Jewish law. I could not resist showing on the screen the new edition that I just completed and published together with a colleague, Andrew Gross, who was at Catholic University in DC. I couldn't reduce a little self-advertising, so I put it on the screen. But in any case, what I want you to realize is that the Temple Scroll was also one of the things that pushed the understanding of the scrolls towards the Jewish nature of the material. And Yigael Yadin gave many, many public lectures, and I think that it was a great stimulus for this in terms of making the point of how Jewish the material really is. Furthermore, another very important step that's going on at the same time, what I want to show you is that the constant progress of Jewish-Christian relations runs with the progress of the scrolls and their study, and runs with the joint study of early Judaism and early Christianity by Jewish and Christian scholars. So there's no question that Vatican-Israel diplomatic relations helped this to happen, and especially because of the fact that right afterwards, the Vatican held a Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit. And this exhibit in 1994 came right on the heels. Some of you may be aware that the Vatican afterwards exhibited some wonderful Hebrew manuscripts in Jerusalem, and the complete change in the relationship also changed the relationship of some individuals. And let's put it this way, the people who felt that they should not cooperate with Israel in study of the scrolls essentially became passé. And without going into all the difficult details that took place during much of the very same period, the reality is that the Vatican's relations with Israel also made the point that Christian and Jewish, and specifically Catholic and Jewish scholars, should be working together in a very different way. So all this I'm trying to show is a gradual increase in this relationship. Now, in 1994, I published this book, which was mentioned before, Reclaiming the Dead Sea Scrolls. And at that time, I still had to argue that people need to understand the scrolls as Jewish texts. Now, I even had a very strong kind of formulation of this, which I never printed, which made the point that somebody who actually didn't see the scrolls as Jewish texts effectively made it impossible to see them as useful for understanding the background of Christianity. This is for a very simple reason. If I want to understand the background of Christianity, I need to understand Second Temple Judaism. If I have these massive documents that I can use to understand Second Temple Judaism, I have to understand them in their own context. If I turn around and turn them into proto-Christian documents, finding Christianity all over in the documents, and I'm now talking about the exaggerated people, not the regular scholars, what I do is I create a situation in which we cannot use them even for understanding Christianity. And my point was that these texts have to be placed in the context of the history of Judaism, because that's really where they belong. And then secondarily, one can say, okay, how does the history of Judaism help us to understand early Christianity? Now, the funny part is much of this was done, at least in the introduction, in a polemical tone. Today, no one would need to do this because in fact, if we could call it that, right, interfaith dialogue that has gone on around the scrolls has clearly come to a consensus of how to understand their relevance to both Judaism and Christianity without having to step on anyone's toes or claim that anybody is somehow or another treating them in a way which is inappropriate. Now, a very important step also, and this is the first, I think, if I got it right from Professor Schuler's article, it's the first Catholic mention formally of the scrolls and their significance for understanding the Bible. Now, the Pontifical Biblical Commission put out this document in Rome in 2001, and in which it's made very clear that if you want to understand the origins of Christianity, you got to understand what's going on in Judaism at the time. You can all read this. It's a little too much to read the time we'll have, but take a little scanning of it and you'll get the point in a minute that they made very clear the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls for understanding the background of the New Testament. And all this within a context, I want to explain this, of an entire document that makes the point that Jewish materials must be understood in their legitimate Jewish context. They can't be somehow or another altered or whatever else. They have to be confronted as what they really are. And once that is done, they provide valuable material for Catholic understanding of the Hebrew scriptures and for background of the New Testament, etc. So this document is a very important document. And I know many scholars have taken an interest in it. The point they want to make, however, simply is that this is another step in the recognition that the scrolls are significant for understanding this early Jewish Christian relationship, and therefore this makes it understood that the scrolls are something that makes it easier or better in terms of Jewish Catholic and Jewish Christian relations in general. Now, throughout the period that we're talking about, there were all kinds of scholarly things going on in which Jewish and Christian scholars were getting together over and over and over at various conferences and meetings, such as the normal annual meetings of the Society of Biblical Literature and other meetings. I want to make the point that these meetings and the discussions that go on are, to a great extent, what I would call disguised dialogue. Now, most scholars will deny this. They will act as if what's going on there is everybody is 100% objective scholar, and they're all just sitting there doing 100% objective scholarship. What I have to say is the amount I have learned from colleagues at these meetings about their religious beliefs and the amount that they have learned about my religious beliefs, and therefore the understanding that is developed among us, and this is a point from Professor Schuler's article as well, is so enormous. Now, we have to remember who these people are. We have to remember that the people who are engaging in what I'm calling the disguised dialogue, maybe it's an unconscious dialogue, are people who teach hundreds and hundreds of students, who teach next generations of professors in their graduate programs, and many of them are influential in their religious groups. And many, in fact, may even be involved in clergy activities, whether full-time or part-time. My point is that this is an extremely important place, not only for dialogue about the subjects we're talking about here, but many other issues that are being discussed at these conferences. Now, I admit that, of course, there are those people present who see things in very different ways and may not value these traditions in the way many of us do. But I have to say right off the bat that when I think about it in terms of the people I've worked with and the people that we meet at these events, I think that it's correct that this is a kind of disguised dialogue. And here you see a picture from a conference in Madrid, Escorial, and I don't want to go over who's here and who's, but this is truly an interfaith group of Jews, Protestants, and Catholics, all of whom are very good friends, work together, many of whom continue to work together. There's some character over there with a black beard and glasses that turn black who may have some resemblance to the speaker. And this shows you how many years ago this thing was. But the point that I make seriously is that this is an amazing group of people that work together in ways that many people would never have expected. And just this fact and what happens with what they communicate to their students all over the world is just an enormous accomplishment of interfaith, as I say, disguised dialogue, if you want to call it that. Now, another thing that brought Jewish and Christian scholars together around the scrolls is a whole bunch of projects. And so I show you the green volumes of the Discoveries of the Judean Desert, which are the official publication of that stuff that had been in Jerusalem, in Jordan. I show you one of the volumes from a Brill series, which is up to about 150 volumes of studies of the scrolls, the Encyclopedia of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I had the honor to be one of the editors of, the Journal Review de Qumran, the Journal Dead Sea Discoveries, the Dead Sea Scrolls series of Charlesworth, et cetera, Jim Charlesworth, et cetera. Every one of these projects is an interfaith project. Now, one can think that unless people are sitting around a table with an agenda of interfaith dialogue, there's no interfaith dialogue going on. I would argue that on every page of these works, there is a form of interfaith dialogue between Jews and Christians that has brought not only many of us together, but have brought many other people together indirectly, because people don't realize how this activity has affected Jewish Catholic and Jewish Christian relations as a whole. Another interesting area for bringing people together is the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibits. You'll see I have here a kind of montage of many of the books that were produced for catalogs of the various exhibits. But I think that here, the most important thing I can do is tell you a funny story. I went to Dallas, Texas, when they had a Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit, to give it was Houston, to give a tour to a synagogue group. And I arrived there and we were waiting to go in, and a church group came along, and the pastor apparently had heard me speak, and he introduced himself to me. And we said hello, and everything was very nice. And the two groups went in. And as I started to give my tour, he told his people, you got to listen to this guy. You know, he's a great scholar of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So anyhow, some character from the museum staff came up and started saying that I can't talk out loud. Now, by that time, there were 100 people now on the tour. I can't talk out loud because it's not right in the exhibit. You're not allowed to do this. And the pastor started screaming at him. And he said, do you know who this guy is? And we toured together. And I can tell you another really hysterical story about the exhibit. I think the one on at least it's on my left, right? Which is the exhibit that took place in Times Square. And I was there repeatedly because I had all kinds of speaking engagements and tours and stuff. One day I'm there, and a bunch of girls in Catholic school uniforms came running up. And one of them says to the other, quote, "He is the one." So after laughing a little bit, I said, like, what are you talking about? She said, well, we saw you on a movie in school. And then the teacher came over, and they eventually joined the tour group, which I was giving for a group of Orthodox Jewish young people. And they all went together to the tour. Now, the point I want to make is this is your example of how these exhibits brought people together, who in some cases may have been naturally had no issue of being together. But this is another thing which is much more important than people sitting in some kind of a, the basement of a church or a synagogue with a bagel or a piece of cake or something like that. Entenmann's cake, which is kosher, which you can buy anywhere, which the Christians often buy when the Jews are coming. And, this kind of thing, right? This is nothing compared to people hanging around and being together, walking around an exhibit, seeing each other, meeting each other, and sometimes having conversations or even joint tours with some scholar who happens to be there. So that, I think, is very important. And here's a list of exhibits that took place up through, right, only 2010. Exhibits have started up again, and in fact, they're working on now intensifying the opportunity to have more exhibits. So we want to get to the question now of what are really the effects of all of the Dead Sea Scrolls on dialogue. And now I'm going to sort of review and conclude. First of all, we have a generation of students trained in an interreligious environment. These students, if they're interested in Dead Sea Scrolls, go to any conference. They're going to meet people from different religious groups. They're going to get friendly with students, other graduate students, and an extent that the scrolls are really a major force in bringing these people together. Many people who've studied the Dead Sea Scrolls, and some Dead Sea Scroll scholars, are religious leaders involved in dialogue today. Many of our former students are involved in local dialogues in various places, and they bring to it their understanding of Second Temple Judaism, early Christianity, and Rabbinic Judaism. Also, the scrolls exhibits brought many Jewish and Christian members of the public and clergy together. In fact, I saw a little bit of a film of a news conference recently where you had in the audience together, so to speak, at the news conference, and some of the people standing behind the speaker. It was a news conference to announce that there would be a Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit. Actually, it was in North Carolina. And there were standing rabbis, priests, right? All kinds of people standing there together, Jews, various types of Christians, I assume, standing together, right, amid these announcements. And of course, all ready to support the exhibit and work to make it a success. The cooperative research has yielded very strong and real friendships, and these are examples to students and to the public. Here, I'll tell you another funny story. James Vanderkam and I were speaking in a series together, which was co-sponsored by some churches and synagogues in a place in New Jersey. So somebody asked a question about the Talmud in the New Testament and whether we could respond to the way in which something that was mentioned in the scrolls was reflecting the Talmud in the New Testament. So we decided to switch places. He would give the Talmud answer, and I would give the New Testament answer. Now, the point here was that it demonstrated to this audience the extent to which we become familiar with what you might call each other's texts. And that's a very important thing, and it sets a certain kind of example. Now, of course, I have to admit, Dead Sea Scrolls set a terrible example when people were fighting over the non-publication of the scrolls. And there's no question that that stuff was counter to the whole increase in good Jewish-Christian relations that we've been seeing over the years. No question about it. But once we hit the stage after that, the complete opposite took place. So Second Temple Judaism also now is completely understood as a forerunner to Judaism and Christianity, which of course is the true situation as far as we know. Very importantly, the more and more we understand common origins, hatred and dissension become absurd. Now, believe it or not, at the beginning, people didn't think that way, and you still have some people who don't really get that fact, but I think it's pretty clear to most people that that is a correct approach. And furthermore, the removal of the basis for anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, there has been a tremendous amount of this in terms of contextualization of New Testament scholarship and the effect of the Holocaust on New Testament scholarship. That's a subject which needs a lot more study because it's really true. And most importantly, the ability to read these texts together has brought us to the point where Jewish-Christian dialogue can be based on common elements, not just differences. So I think that we could say that what I said earlier needs to be repeated, that it's kind of bizarre and funny that a group of ancient texts that discussed really tremendous dissension between groups, in which the group that we're talking about, the Dead Sea sectarians, actually preached hatred for non-members. And this texts were like, the height of dissension in Second Temple Judaism. And then these texts went through a period of contest and dissension. And to be honest, some of that contest and dissension was between Jews and Christians. And ironically, but happily and wonderfully, these texts ended up creating a basis for Jewish-Christian dialogue. They ended up being one of the factors that helped to bring about reconciliation between Judaism and Christianity to the extent that we've been successful in making that happen. And they seem to have been an encourager and a factor in bringing about Vatican II and the various documents that have come afterwards, some of which actually mention the scrolls. And so these texts that were once upon a time texts of dissension became texts of unity and cooperation and dialogue, even if that dialogue isn't the thing that very often is called Jewish-Christian dialogue in the formal settings in which it often takes place. Thank you very much.
Wow, that's an amazing image. Thank you so much, Dr. Schiffman, for this incredible talk. What we're going to do now is draw from some comments and questions in the chat box, but also if you think of a question or a comment over the next few minutes, we could just stop share.
Yeah, you
Okay, whenever you get there is fine. Great. So if you have a question that you have not put in the chat box, you can also use the hand raise feature, and we'll call on you and you can feel free to unmute and ask your question directly to Dr. Schiffman. But I'll start with a question from Bob Frazee, and also Bob, you can feel free to unmute yourself. I will paraphrase your comment and then you can feel free to clarify. But Bob asks whether you can, Dr. Schiffman, elaborate a little bit on the difference between scholarship and dialogue and why it's significant. And what I'm understanding, Bob, to ask is there any dissonance or any tension between scholarly findings and what you might find in dialogue groups, or are these one and the same?
Yeah, I actually thought that what he was asking about is somewhat more about the form, because let me answer both, try to answer both of these questions, because I think it's important to realize that what happens at Jewish Christian dialogues very often is that you have like two teams, and they may be sitting interspersed, or they may even be sitting on opposite sides of the room, and an agenda which is created in order to have certain formal discussions. Now, even if these formal successions are highly successful, they're often about things of which we're going to come to agree, which is a good idea. So just as an example, I attended one actually held in Greece with the Eastern Orthodox Church, in which the discussion was about the environment. And speakers spoke about our religious traditions pertaining to the environment. And then the group in the end comes to some kind of conclusion. Now, this type of thing, it may be very useful and very nice. But what happens often at these meetings is that they're really not talking about what do the religious texts really mean, because they very often, or they might be talking about the problem of poverty and what can we do about poverty. Many important things, don't get me wrong, but it's not the same thing as laboring over, wait a minute, does this New Testament passage parallel or not parallel this Dead Sea Scrolls passage? How would this Talmudic reference affect what we understand about this text? So what's happening in the academic scene, ironically, is that there is close study together of the religious texts, namely what amounts to really all those that were part of that whole history we talked about, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, Philo, Josephus, the whole Second Temple literature, as well as the New Testament and rabbinic literature, and sometimes even maybe some other later material. So what's going on is that here, the actual stuff is being studied. So that's point number one. Point number two about whether would be a conflict of the two things. Well, look, I think in an academic atmosphere, because we always want to be as close as we can to accurate and honest about what the texts say. So, of course, there are some texts which say things which are anti the other group, but these are always put into historical context, so they can be dealt with in an honest way without any problem at all. They don't have to be hidden. I'm not sure in a dialogue meeting that one would want to trot out some of those particular texts, right? So I don't think that we would. And of course, we have to realize that in all religious texts that we know, there are some things that are said about other people that aren't necessarily but the ones we would want to say today to our friend from the other religion. So the point is, in the academic setting, you don't have a problem with that. In the dialogue setting, those things are usually avoided, maybe for good reason.
Thank you very much. I want to move on to a comment from Zachary Gelman. And the comment has to do with variance, textual variance at Qumran. And Zachary asks, what do these variants tell us about the multiplicity of textual traditions that may have been circulating late in the Second Temple era? I'll read the second question. I'm not sure that I understand it. So Zachary, feel free to hop in. And how he asks, how can the mere existence of diverse scribal traditions be overstated
Oh,
as far as their relevance for questions of authenticity and canon?
I think I get it. So
Okay,
here's the thing. Let's start from the beginning. He's talking about Hebrew Bible texts that have variants.
right.
Now, it's very funny. I just started writing a paper today, wrote the first 3 pages of a paper that I've been asked to give about what one can get information about this from certain non-biblical texts in the scrolls. So let me explain for people who don't know this, that first, there are different types of differences in the Hebrew Bible text that's found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are some texts that look like the ones we're used to. And I should point out that by the time we reach the scrolls found in Masada and the Bar Kokhba texts, Masada was basically attacked in 73 CE, and the Bar Kokhba texts were hidden in caves between 132 and 5 CE. When we reach those Bibles, they're almost exactly like the Hebrew Bible that you'd buy in the Jewish bookstore today. Now, we have to understand that large numbers of these variants are linguistic variants because many biblical scrolls have a different scribal writing system, spelling system. So they really mean nothing. Then there are some variants which are variations that result from legitimate textual variants, like a synonym instead of the word that was there, or 2 extra words explaining something like that. I always joke that you will not find thou shalt steal or thou shalt commit adultery, right? The Bible is the Bible. That's Eugene Ulrich's formulation. The good news is that the Bible is the Bible. The bad news is there are some variants. Now, so these variants don't really, it depends how you want to look at it. You want to look at half full or half empty. On the half full side, they seem to say, hey, wait a minute, it's the Bible. On the half empty side, it's clear that the Bible circulated not just in one authoritative version, as we would sort of understand it from later on, but it circulated in some varying text traditions in which we can find in some places things that are obviously additions or whatever, and not really primary, but in some places we can find readings that some scholars believe are probably, we can call them more the original reading that may have been in the Hebrew Bible. So I don't think it detracts from the authenticity of the Bible because the message is exactly the same. And by the way, we were talking here at Catholic Theological Union, everybody probably knows that there are places where the New Testament is citing Hebrew Bible, and there are readings there that are different from the one that are more or less in the authoritative Hebrew Bibles. And the Septuagint, which was used for the quotations in the New Testament, often has differences that may be legitimate variants, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're interpretations or errors, but there are legitimate variant texts in the Septuagint. And once in a while, these are reflected in the New Testament. And once in a while, the New Testament may conflate 2 Hebrew Bible verses and make them into one. And we know that everything wasn't quite as tight in those days as it was later on. And that you see that now. Your point is a correct one, I think, that very often this is overstated. For example, I read somewhere that there are 20,000 differences in the Isaiah scroll from Qumran from our Isaiah. Well, that's true because they're all spelling different, because he has a different system for the way in which he writes the Hebrew. But most of the variants are either minor or synonymous and don't have any effect on the meaning. So I think your point is that they can be overstated. And I think part of the reason that they look overstated is because people have the idea that there can't have been any ancient variations in the texts the way they were transmitted. And there indeed were. I hope that's an answer without giving another lecture.
Zachary, are we satisfied? Can we move on? I don't know if he can unmute. All right, he says, great. Okay, so my friend Jean-Pierre Ruiz has a question for you on a totally different subject. He wants to know what you think about the hypothesis of early Christian Dead Sea Scroll scholars who posited that Qumran might have been a monastery of sorts, and understanding what took place there as analogous to Christian monasticism, religious orders. And he suggests that maybe one might think of the notion of a scriptorium, which he says was influenced by the Dominican religious order membership.
Right. So this
yeah.
this is a very interesting thing. What I did was I took a paragraph, which I admittedly made up, in which I took all these monastery terms, and in my book, Reclaiming the Dead Sea Scrolls, I translated that paragraph. I have to recognize here Jean Duhem translated the work into French, right? He's online here with us. And it's good to see people that I know here. At any rate, I made this paragraph, and I took the paragraph and I wrote it as if it was a monastery, and I wrote the whole same thing as if it was a yeshiva. And the bottom line is that a lot of this is in language. If I say there was a refectory as opposed to a dining room, I've now made it sound like a monastery. So I think we have to understand the basic question about the monastery is whether the people were celibate. Now, it's clear that most of the people who died in the Qumran, well, I would say died in the Qumran cemetery, died and are buried in the Qumran cemetery, were men. And the question is why? Now, the texts say that the members married, and the texts give various laws pertaining to menstrual impurity and all kind of stuff like this. On the other hand, the rule of the community does not mention women. Now, I don't know if anybody knows what very important American document doesn't mention women. I'll clue you in, it's the Constitution. And the people who wrote the Constitution were not celibate. So that fact isn't so important. What I think is important is to realize that there are two possible theories here. One view, that they were literally celibate. Remember, Josephus says the Essenes had two kinds, married and celibate. The other possibility is that these were men who came to the site in order to advance through the initiation process of the sect, after which they would return home. According to that view, they wouldn't be celibate. Now, more and more people are arguing for women at Qumran. And I think there is some small amount of evidence for that. And there are a small number of women and children buried in a separate cemetery, which is, also a very much smaller number. It's something like 60 people as opposed to 1,200 graves. But at any rate, it could be that these were the leaders who stayed there permanently. There are different theories that can be put forward. But what I would say is the problem is not the simple statement that monasticism may have taken off from some religious orders. It's when one tries to do this in a direct manner. So here I have to step back to something that wasn't our subject today. And if we would ask actually, what is the relationship of the scrolls to Christianity? So here we have to understand a very important thing. We happen to know about the Dead Sea sectarians. We happen to know about them because of a fantastic coincidence that they were living in a place where the climate would preserve these scrolls that they gathered. We don't know the whole of Second Temple Judaism beyond the texts that we have. And this group here may or may not have been mentioned in those texts, certainly not mentioned in the New Testament or the Talmud, as I mentioned. Maybe the Essenes mentioned by Philo and Josephus, but whatever the case is, the reality is that we can't say that because some people have some characteristics that like some other characteristics, they got it from this group. We have no way to do that. And that's where the problem comes. If we knew all the groups that lived, it was like today where you could look, you can really know almost everything. Then you can decide who influenced whom. In our situation of early Christianity, we have to say that there could have been, we know that there were actually quite a number of other groups, and those other groups may have passed on traditions as part of the general culture to various groups that then became your early Christian monastic groups. So that's where the problem is. It's not whether or not it's possible that these people had an influence. And by the way, I always say to students, if somebody asks in class, is it possible that? I say, look, if you're in this class and you're doing the work and you ask if it's possible, there's only one answer. Yes, of course it's possible. That's what we want to know. We want to know if it's probable. Now, the problem here is we don't know what other groups existed who may have conducted themselves in similar ways, and therefore may be the actual influence. And this goes with like any one of the details that one comes up with.
Well, it's an outstanding lecture when the questions and comments keep on coming. And the questions and comments that you can see is just a fraction of what I've received via private message, which I guess is a metaphor for the surviving Qumran documents, which is just a fraction of what exists from the Second Temple period. In any case, we do have to wrap up, respecting Dr. Schiffman's time. And I want to thank Dr. Schiffman once again for delivering this outstanding and thought-provoking talk. Really, thank you so much. You see the hands. You see the
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming virtually to our computers. Dr. Schiffman's books are available on all major bookselling websites and at a bookseller near you. I encourage you to read all of his scholarship. I want to thank the Shapiro Foundation for their generous sponsorship, Dr. Stephen Millies, Director of CTU's Bernardine Center, Mr. Peter Cunningham, Associate Director of the Bernardine Center, Ms. Madison Chastain at CTU's Marketing Office, and many, many others for their help and support in planning this event. Please do stay tuned for our upcoming events this academic year, including our Winter Shapiro Lecture on February 6th, which will feature Dr. Donna Fishkin of Touro College, and the Spring Shapiro Lecture on March 13th, which will be delivered by Dr. Sam Liebens of the University of Haifa. Please also mark your calendars for our annual Chaim Perlmutter Conference in Jewish Christian Dialogue, which will take place on March 13th and 14th. Registration for these and other events are now on our website, ctu.edu/events. We hope to see all of you again very soon. Thank you and good night.